They laughed when they asked his rank, the kind of laugh that carried just enough disrespect to sting, but not enough to be openly punished. And he noticed it immediately, even though his face remained calm and unreadable. Years of discipline having trained his muscles to betray nothing. Because the instructors saw only an elderly man in a plain uniform with faded ribbons and assumed time had softened him the way it softened metal left too long in salt air. And the classroom had that familiar smell of polish and recycled air, the kind every naval facility shared, where authority usually flowed in one direction, and questions like that were never jokes. But today it was, or so they thought, as one instructor leaned casually against the desk and said, "So, old-timer, what was your rank back in the day?" While a few cadets exchanged smirks, expecting a harmless answer. Maybe petty officer, maybe lieutenant, something respectable but forgettable. And the man's eyes drifted briefly to the window where the flag moved slowly in the wind, reminding him of mornings long past when silence carried more weight than laughter. And he thought of ships cutting through black water, of orders whispered instead of shouted, of responsibility so heavy it pressed into his chest even now, but he did not rush to answer. Because power learned patience long before it learned command. And that pause unsettled the room more than any sharp rebuke could have, because silence, when worn correctly, was louder than arrogance, and finally he turned back. His voice steady and quiet, not rising to meet the joke, not lowering to accept it, and he said, "Fleet Admiral," and the word fell into the room like a dropped instrument on a steel deck. Sudden and impossible to ignore, and for a heartbeat nothing happened. Because disbelief often comes first, the mind scrambling to protect itself from embarrassment by rejecting reality. And one instructor let out a short, awkward chuckle, assuming sarcasm, until he noticed that no one else was laughing. Because something in the man's posture had changed, not visibly, but perceptibly. Like the moment before a storm when the air feels heavier. And the senior instructor's smile began to fade as he realized the joke had reversed direction. Now aimed squarely at them, and the room grew quiet in that way only military spaces can, where even breathing feels out of regulation. And the cadets sat straighter without knowing why, reacting to instinct rather than instruction. Because authority, when real, required no announcement. And the old man did not repeat himself or explain. He did not list commands or battles or decorations. Because he did not need to, and the instructors exchanged glances, unsure whether to challenge him or retreat. And it was that uncertainty that marked the shift of power. Because men who were used to command suddenly found themselves calculating consequences. And one of them cleared his throat and asked for clarification, attempting to regain control with procedure. "Sir, could you clarify?" And the man nodded once, slowly, as if granting permission rather than receiving it, and said, "Retired," and that single word carried more finality than any rank spoken loudly. Because retirement did not erase authority. It merely removed the need to exercise it, and now the laughter had fully evaporated, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that they might have misjudged the room. The man and themselves, and the cadets sensed it too. Eyes moving between the instructors and the guest, reading a lesson no syllabus had prepared them for. That respect was not demanded by volume or youth or confidence, but earned through weight, and the senior instructor finally straightened, instinctively adjusting his stance. His voice noticeably more formal as he asked about service years, deployments, commands, and the old man answered briefly, efficiently. Each response clipped and precise, revealing just enough to confirm truth without indulging curiosity. And as the minutes passed, the instructors realized that every attempt to steer the conversation back to their authority only emphasized how little of it they truly held in this moment. Because the man was not competing with them, he was simply present, and presence, when forged over decades of command, bent rooms quietly. And the cadets leaned forward now, not because they were told to, but because something rare was unfolding. A living example of the difference between rank worn and rank earned, and one cadet, younger than the rest and bold in the way only the inexperienced could be, raised a hand and asked what it was like to hold such responsibility. And the room held its breath, wondering if the man would deflect or dismiss. But instead he looked at the cadet directly and said, "It means you don't sleep," and a few nervous smiles appeared. But then he continued, "Because when you close your eyes, lives move without you, and you must trust what you built to hold." And that silenced the room again, because it stripped glamour from the title and revealed its cost, and the instructors felt it too. The weight behind the words pressing against their earlier mockery, now painfully out of place, and the senior instructor nodded slowly, respect replacing embarrassment, and said, "We appreciate your time, Admiral," emphasizing the title properly now, and the man inclined his head, not in gratitude but acknowledgement, and as the session ended, the cadets stood instinctively, no command given, chairs scraping softly as they rose, honoring something older than protocol. And the old man walked toward the door without ceremony, but before leaving, he turned back once, scanning the room with eyes that had seen far worse than awkward laughter, and said, "Never ask a question you aren't prepared to answer yourself." And then he was gone, leaving behind a silence that no one rushed to fill, because they understood that what had just happened was not humiliation, but instruction, delivered without cruelty. And long after the door closed, the instructors remained still, replaying the moment when a joke became a lesson, when assumed authority dissolved under the quiet gravity of true command. And each of them knew, without saying it aloud, that they would never again measure a man by how loudly he spoke or how young he looked, because they had just been reminded that the most powerful rank in the room often belonged to the one who did not need to announce it. They did not speak for several minutes after he left, because the room itself seemed to require time to reset, as if the walls had absorbed the moment and were unwilling to release it too quickly. And the senior instructor finally dismissed the cadets earlier than scheduled, citing a change in lesson plan, though everyone knew the lesson had already been delivered in a way no manual could replicate. And as the cadets filed out, their usual chatter muted. The instructors remained behind, exchanging glances heavy with unspoken realization, because authority once shaken did not immediately settle back into place. And one of the younger instructors broke the silence with an uneasy laugh, attempting to diffuse the tension. But it fell flat, echoing the earlier mistake, and the senior instructor shot him a look that ended the sound instantly, because humor had lost its footing in that space. And instead there was reflection, sharp and uncomfortable. And the senior instructor sat down slowly, rubbing his temples, replaying the first laugh, the careless tone, the assumption that age equaled irrelevance. And he knew better, had always known better in theory. But theory was a poor shield against habit. And habits, once exposed, were humiliating to confront. And somewhere down the hall, the old man's footsteps faded. MEAZURED and unhurried, carrying him toward a meeting he had not requested, but one that would now unfold very differently than planned, because news traveled fast in military spaces, faster than gossip in civilian ones. And by the time he reached the administrative wing, his name had already begun to surface in hushed corrections and sudden posture adjustments, and a junior officer at the desk looked up, glanced at the visitor log, then looked again, eyes widening slightly as recognition clicked. And he stood so abruptly his chair skidded back, offering a salute that was sharp but nervous. And the old man returned it casually, almost lazily, not out of disrespect but familiarity, because salutes had long ago stopped meaning flattery and started meaning acknowledgement. And he signed in with steady handwriting that betrayed none of his years. And as he waited, his thoughts drifted not to the classroom but further back, to his first command, when he himself had mistaken volume for leadership, had thought certainty meant inflexibility, and had learned otherwise the hard way, through mistakes measured in lives and steel. And those lessons had etched themselves into him deeper than rank insignia ever could. And the door to the briefing room opened, revealing a group of officers mid-conversation, their words trailing off as they noticed him. Recognition passing through the room like an electrical current. And one by one they stood, conversation replaced by formal greetings. And for a brief moment, the old man saw himself reflected in their eyes. Not as an elderly guest, but as an embodiment of something larger. Institutional memory given form. And he acknowledged them with a nod, taking a seat without. Some habits never left, and the meeting began awkwardly. The agenda suddenly feeling inadequate, because how did one discuss minor policy adjustments in the presence of someone who had once shaped entire theaters of operation? And the officers stumbled through updates. Voices too careful, too rehearsed, and the old man listened patiently, offering no interruption, no correction, letting them find their footing. Because leadership, at its highest level, understood when silence taught more than speech. And eventually one officer, braver or perhaps more honest than the rest, asked what the old man thought of the current training methods. And the room tensed, anticipating critique. But he surprised them by asking the question instead, "Do they teach judgment?" And the officers exchanged uncertain looks, because judgment was difficult to quantify, harder to test, and easier to assume. And the old man nodded as if their hesitation answered him sufficiently. And he said, "You can teach procedures in a classroom. Judgment comes from consequence." And the weight of that statement settled heavily. Because consequence was something the system tried to minimize, sanitize, simulate, but never fully replicate, and he went on, speaking quietly but firmly, about the danger of mistaking confidence for competence, of promoting those who spoke best rather than those who listened hardest. And the officers listened. Some defensively, some gratefully, but all attentively. Because criticism from experience carried a different flavor than criticism from theory. And as the meeting progressed, tension eased into respect, then into something resembling gratitude, because few had the courage or position to say these things plainly. And the old man did not linger afterward, excusing himself politely, declining invitations for lunch or extended discussion, because he understood the value of restraint. And as he exited the building, sunlight catching the edges of the flag once more, he allowed himself a small breath. Not of relief but of completion, because he had not come outside. The base continued its routine as if nothing unusual had occurred. Vehicles moving in regulated patterns, voices calling cadence. The machinery of order humming along uninterrupted. Yet beneath that surface, something subtle had shifted. Because moments like these did not announce themselves with alarms or reports. They embedded quietly into memory, altering future decisions in ways no one could fully trace. And the old man walked slowly along the path toward the parking area. His steps unhurried, because urgency had long ago stopped governing his movements. And with each step he felt the familiar distance between who he was now and who he had once been. A distance measured not in rank but in burden. And he remembered a time when he would have replayed the classroom moment with sharp clarity, analyzing it for advantage or weakness, but now it passed through him differently. Not as triumph, not as insult corrected, but as a necessary friction between generations. And he paused briefly near a memorial plaque set into the ground. Names etched cleanly into stone, and he removed his cap, standing still as personnel passed without interrupting him, because some gestures required no audience. And as he stood there, his mind returned to the beginning, to the day he had first learned how easily authority could be misplaced, when he had been a young officer standing where the instructors now stood, confident in regulation and untested by consequence, and how an older commander had once dismantled his certainty with a single calm question. Not to humiliate him, but to prepare him. And it struck him then that the cycle was unbroken, that every generation learned the same lessons in different uniforms. And the danger was never ignorance, but arrogance. Because ignorance could be corrected, while arrogance resisted correction until it was too late. And he replaced his cap and continued walking. Reaching his car as a junior sailor jogged up nervously, apologizing for the interruption, explaining that the senior instructor had asked if he might speak with the Admiral once more. And the old man studied the sailor's face, seeing sincerity rather than obligation, and nodded, following him back not to the classroom but to a quieter office, where the senior instructor stood alone, posture rigid but expression honest, and the instructor spoke first, acknowledging the earlier moment without excuses, admitting that familiarity had bred carelessness, that the joke had revealed something uncomfortable about himself. And the old man listened without interrupting, because apologies, when sincere, deserved full attention. And when the instructor finished, waiting for judgment, the old man simply said, "You corrected it," and the instructor looked confused, until the old man continued, "You adjusted." That's all leadership is, and the tension drained from the room, replaced by relief that felt earned rather than granted. And the instructor asked if there was anything else he should tell his cadets. Any final lesson, and the old man considered this carefully, because words given lightly were often forgotten, and finally he said, "Teach them to listen to the quiet ones," and he did not elaborate, because those who needed the explanation would eventually understand it themselves. And with that he left again, this time uninterrupted, driving away from the base as the gate lifted smoothly, guards saluting with crisp precision. And as the road stretched ahead, the old man felt a familiar sensation, not pride, but distance. The gentle separation that came with knowing one's role was no longer to command outcomes, but to influence direction. And he thought of the cadets who would talk about the moment later in low voices, embellishing some details, omitting others, but carrying forward the core of it, that rank could exist without noise, that authority could exist without display, and that respect, once lost, could sometimes be regained through humility. And miles passed as the base receded in his rearview mirror, replaced by open road and civilian signs, and he welcomed the anonymity that returned with each mile, because it allowed him to simply be a man again rather than a symbol. And as he drove, he reflected that silence had followed him that day, not because people feared him, but because they recognized something larger than themselves. And that recognition, fleeting as it was, had served its purpose. And by the time he reached his destination, the day already felt distant, folded neatly into the long narrative of a life spent balancing command and restraint. And he knew that tomorrow the instructors would resume their routines, the cadets their training, the base its rhythm. But somewhere in that system a subtle adjustment would persist, an extra pause before laughter, a second look before assumption, and that was enough. Because leadership was never about being remembered. It was about leaving behind something that continued to work in your absence, quietly, efficiently, and without needing to be announced.